Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So, this week, in honor of Halloween, we are doing Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, we are reading several selections from Poe. So, I posted several short stories and several poems that I would like you guys to read this week. It's not a terribly heavy reading load, but I would like us to experience the many different flavors, the many different sides of Poe. Because as we're going to see today, Poe is more complex and I think more of a sort of complete writer than he's often given credit for. So we all know Poe to some extent. That's why I think it's always interesting to study him in a class like this, because unlike a lot of the authors that we've been looking at so far, we probably already have a certain level of familiarity with Poe. Even if we haven't read a lot of his stuff, chances are we've been exposed to him at some point in our previous educational lives. And as I would like to talk about today, Poe also kind of lives on in our contemporary popular culture. And that's what sets him apart from a lot of the other authors that we've been looking at so far. So if you talk to American lit nerds like me, yeah, we can tell you a lot about Charles Brockton Brown or Philip Freneau or Hannah Webster Foster, but those writers don't really live on in the popular imagination. They don't really live on in our pop culture. Even authors like Phyllis Wheatley and Anne Bradstreet, who play these really outsized, major, important roles in the development of early American literature, same with Susanna Rowson, they're not really remembered by a lot of people in the general public. Again, if we're leaving academia, if we are leaving English departments, the question is, how well do we know these figures from early American lit? And the answer is usually not very well, even if you look at an author like Irving. And we talked about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow last week and how that text lives on in the popular imagination even today. A lot of us maybe saw cartoons based on it, or we read a graphic novel based on it, or maybe we saw the movie adaptation, or maybe we've seen none of those, but we still know the title. We were at least vaguely familiar with the story, even if we hadn't read it, even if we never watched it in another sort of form, adapted to a different medium. We're just kind of familiar with it because the title is out there. It's just kind of permeated our pop culture. But Irving himself, Irving as a figure, Irving as a celebrity, and as we said, he was kind of our first literary celebrity, but we don't remember him really anymore outside of English departments, outside of academia. But Poe's different. Poe has taken on a sort of public persona that we still see today. And I would actually like to provide a little bit of personal color to this story, to this phenomenon. I don't normally do this. I don't typically like to talk about myself. That's not what we're here for. But I have a little bit of an indirect connection to Poe. When I was getting my master's many years ago, one of my professors at the College of Charleston was a pretty well-known, a pretty preeminent Poe scholar. And he was a relatively young guy by college professor standards. He was only like in his 40s, probably, quite a bit older now, as we all are. But, he was one of the editors of Poe Studies, which is a pretty long-standing, pretty respectable academic journal devoted to the study of Poe, obviously. So he co-edited that journal with another professor in Washington State. But anyway, I was one of his students, and I was also his GA, his graduate assistant. So I helped him a little bit on Poe Studies. I just did some kind of menial editorial work, helping him with some basic tasks. But between taking his class and working a little bit on Poe studies, I did learn a lot about Poe. And while I was his student, Dr. Peoples, that was his name, Scott Peoples, he's still at the College of Charleston today. He's been there forever. He wrote and published an article during my time at the school about what he called the Poe effect. And I've just always been fascinated by this. He and I had conversations about it. It's something that he obviously knows a lot more about than I do, but I will try to sort of paraphrase him as best I can. And I think this is really relevant for us as we first start to approach some of these texts, because again, we all know Poe to some extent, even if we haven't read him. And that's what Peoples is talking about. He says that in our pop culture, and again, this is about 15 years ago that he's writing, but I don't think it's changed. He's saying in our popular culture, Poe remains kind of a fixture. He has a great example, and I think this is still true. If you go to Barnes and Noble, I know not many of us still buy our books in person, but if you go to a Barnes and Noble store, they'll have this little sort of cartoony drawing of Poe on a lot of their bags, like their official Barnes and Noble bags. I think they still do. And you can kind of see these cartoon versions of Poe in a lot of places. You can see Poe turn up as a character in graphic novels, in certain shows, in other forms of media. I don't know if any of you are fans of the science fiction show Altered Carbon, but in season 1, I haven't seen all of season 2, so I'm not sure. I think he does show up again in season 2, but I'm mostly thinking about the first season. But anyway, there's a character. Edgar Allan Poe is a character in the show, but he's sort of like an AI program, but he's essentially a hotel owner. But it's complex. It's complicated. But Poe turns up as a character. Occasionally he'll recite some lines of his poetry in the show. So it's kind of silly, but you can tell that the creators of the show, they obviously are fans of Poe. They like to work in some of Poe's text a little bit into the show, even though Poe doesn't have a direct tie-in to most of the action, most of the thematics of the show, but a lot of creative types, a lot of showrunners, a lot of filmmakers, and obviously a lot of writers like Poe. They read Poe. They're at least somewhat influenced by Poe. So he shows up all over the place. But what Peoples talks about in particular is this tendency that we have to kind of simplify Poe, or to sort of make him into a cartoon or a caricature. That's really what Peoples is interested in. And we typically, nowadays, we think of Poe really only in terms of his Gothic horror. And of course, it's funny that I bring this up, because the whole reason we're doing Poe this week is because it coincides with Halloween. So I am falling into the very trap that Dr. Peoples pointed out, which is we reduce Poe to his horror. We reduce him to this, persona of kind of a weird, creepy guy, the master of the macabre, somebody who's very interested in insanity, evil, sort of irrational impulses, and all of that's true. Poe does explore a lot of those ideas in his literature. But as I learned from Dr. Peoples, and as I hope that we can learn this week together, Poe did a lot of other stuff beyond just the Gothic horror. He was a much more well-rounded author than that sort of cartoon version of Poe might indicate. Not everything he did was spooky and scary. A lot of his best remembered work would fall under the spooky and scary category, but as we're going to see this week, as hopefully we've already seen, he also writes comedy. He also writes detective fiction. He's obviously a very accomplished poet. Now, most of his poetry is more or less classified as Gothic romanticism, but not necessarily all of it. So Poe does work in a lot of different registers and a lot of different genres. And we tend to forget that when we just look at the cartoon or when we just look at Poe as a character. Because Peoples points out, again, that's what makes Poe different from a lot of his contemporaries, from a lot of other important early American writers. Poe himself has kind of become a character now. And we focus a little bit more on that public persona of Poe than we do on the actual texts written by Poe. And that's what I mean. A lot of people, even if they've never read The Raven, they kind of know what it's about. Even if you've never read any of his short stories, you have some general impressions of them. You know a little bit of what they're about. So People says this is kind of a double-edged sword. On one side, he says the pop culture Poe, he calls this the Poe effect, right? So Poe continues to be this force in pop culture. He says that's unique when we're talking about 19th century American authors. This is a unique effect. And he says on one side, it's good. It's a good thing because it keeps Poe alive and it sort of keeps him relevant for new generations of readers. But he says not everybody is necessarily reading Poe. Some people just like the character, they like the public persona, so that's the downside. He says this Poe effect sort of makes us inclined to oversimplify Poe and to simply reduce him to the master of the macabre, the spooky, scary guy, and that's all he is. When in reality, he plays a much larger role in the development of early American lit. And again, he's just more than that. He's just a much more interesting writer than what that sort of reductive description might suggest. So Peoples is kind of torn about it, but he brings up a lot of interesting places where Poe appears, and I don't have this list in front of me, but you guys might already know some of these. Again, movies. There have been a lot of movie adaptations of Poe texts, also graphic novels. And again, I'm talking about Poe showing up as a character and adaptations of short stories and poems written by Poe. So you guys might notice, and I've already mentioned TV as well, you guys might notice in the week 9 module, I posted a couple of movie clips. So you guys, if you only feel like you can, watch those if you have time. Don't feel like you're required to, but I just wanted to kind of give you guys a few examples of what I'm talking about. So they're both just previews. They're not the entire films. But that 1935 film, The Raven, is exactly what Peoples is talking about here. That movie has very little to do with the poem written by Poe, but it's kind of influenced by the public persona of Poe. This idea that Poe was kind of interested in murder and insanity and torture and perversity. So that movie, you guys might be able to gather this from watching the preview. It's about this sort of murderous madman. I think he's like a doctor of some kind. And he's like inhabited by the spirit of Edgar Allan Poe, and there is a raven that he kind of hangs out with, but it has nothing to do with the poem. It's just that the character is sort of influenced by Poe, and he tortures people in honor of Poe. It's really kind of nonsensical if you think about it, because Poe as an individual person was not some murderous madman. He had his problems, certainly, but again, we're taking some kernels of truth, some biographical facts that we know about Poe. Yeah, he was a little bit of a wild card. He drank too much. He had some problems. But again, they're really running with the public persona, and they're not trying to be faithful to the text at all. The other movie preview comes from a 1960s sort of B horror movie, a B film directed by Roger Corman, who's kind of a B movie master. He did a lot of sort of schlocky, campy horror and sci-fi movies throughout the 50s and 60s. Now, in this case, the movie is a little bit more true to the atmosphere and the mood of the actual short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, but they change aspects of the plot. They make it a lot more melodramatic. It's very campy. It's very over the top. You might recognize Vincent Price. He plays Roderick Usher in the film. He's kind of a famous campy horror film actor from the mid 20th century. He shows up in a few different Poe adaptations. So again, we've had a bunch of Poe inspired movies, several of them directed by Roger Corman. He did one based on The Mask of the Red Death. He did one based on Ligeia. I think the premature burial as well. So again, there's a whole cottage industry of fiction that's based on Poe, at least loosely based on text written by Poe. But then, like I've said, there's also examples of fiction where Poe's just a character. Poe's a weird, kind of eccentric, crazy guy who pops up for some color, some shenanigans or whatever. So it's just interesting to think about that. And to think about why it is that Poe lives on. I think we can sort of find a few of those reasons today as we look at his text, but also just to think about the kind of distortion that Peoples is kind of pointing out with this whole Poe effect. The idea that, yeah, he lives on, we remember him. Hopefully that inspires new people to read him, new students to get interested in him, but at the same time, we simplify him and we kind of make him into a caricature when in reality, maybe we should take him slightly more seriously. But we can laugh at him if we want, we can think of him as a character if we want, but mostly I want us to just realize the breadth of his achievements and all of the different ways that he contributed to the development of a uniquely national literature. So let me just kind of briefly go through some of the different genres that he is working in. And I've included a few of these in the Week 9 overview, but I just want to run through the different genres and kind of give a couple of examples because we've read a lot of these. Obviously, we can't really do justice to Poe. He was a very prolific writer, so we're only reading a pretty small selection of his short fiction. We're going to talk about his poetry a little bit more towards the end of lecture. For now, I just want to stick with the short fiction, and let's just think about some of these different genres. So we know about the Gothic Romanticism, and I would like to talk a little bit more about that term. We've already discussed it in relation to Charles Brockton Brown, and Poe's very much operating in sort of a similar vein to Brown, but I'm going to bring in a few more definitions that might help us understand Gothic Romanticism in general and sort of Poe's take on it in particular, because again, it's similar to Brown, but Poe comes later. Poe's a later stage in this evolution. So we'll talk about that. We already know about the Gothic Romanticism and just the sheer horror. As we're going to see, Poe provides a lot of templates, a lot of standards for what would later come to be sort of recognized as the horror genre. So we know that, but let's also think about some of the others. So he does write some satirical and comedic short fiction, and we did see an example with The Man That Was Used Up. So this is a topical satire, and we're going to talk about it a little bit later in lecture, but Poe wrote several topical satires where he's kind of tackling, current events of the day and commenting on them in a humorous fashion. So he wrote several stories like this, not only what we read, but also Some Words with a Mummy, How to Write a Blackwoods article. He's not often given credit for being funny, but he really is. He also works within what we might call sort of early science fiction or proto-science fiction. The balloon hoax, The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. These are a couple of short stories that would fall under this heading. And also the one novel that Poe wrote. He wasn't really a novelist. He almost exclusively stuck to short fiction, poetry, and he was also a critic, as we're going to talk about. He was a critic. He ran literary, periodicals, journals, magazines. Much like Brown, he was kind of a man of letters. He edited, he wrote reviews of other people's work. So we'll get to that as well. But he only really tackled one novel over the course of his career, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. And we consider this to sort of be early science fiction. It's very strange and involves a journey to Antarctica and this strange group of people who live there. It's definitely playing around with scientific concepts, geography. It's a little bit surreal. But like I said, Poe's not really a novelist, and that's the only novel he ever completed. And we might see some reasons why as we move along. He also wrote what many scholars consider to be like prose poems. And these would be texts like The Mask of the Red Death, The Pit and the Pendulum, stuff that many of us may have read at earlier levels of school. He's also championed as an early writer of detective fiction. Again, Poe's very innovative. A lot of the things that Poe did in the 1830s and 1840s, it's not that he was inventing the forms or the genres, but he helped to popularize them, he helped to codify them, and he helped to kind of set the standards that future generations of American writers would often follow. So that's very much true with his work in detective fiction. Again, he didn't really invent detective fiction, but he very much helped to popularize it in the U.S. So we saw an example of this with the Purloined Letter. We could also see this in the murders in the Rue Morgue. And he wrote some other detective-themed fiction as well. So we'll come back to those. And then we also have what we might call, we have the psychological horror that we've already kind of talked about, the Gothic influence stuff like The Fall of the House of Usher. But we also have other psychological tales, psychological horror that might not draw so much on the Gothic. They're a little bit more steeped in what we might think of as realism. So like The Telltale Heart would be an example of psychological horror that's not necessarily Gothic. Or Berenice is another one that's very psychological in nature. So again, clearly a lot of scary stuff, but just notice that there are other genres at work. He also has what are sometimes classified as tales of the occult. So these are tales very much about supernatural occurrences. They're not always necessarily scary, although oftentimes they are. So the Tale of the Ragged Mountains would be one. Ligeia is another. The Premature Burial. Poe is very interested in premature burials, getting buried alive. But the premature burial itself is kind of comic. And then he explores that sort of trope in other contexts in a much more sort of horror style. Then he also has what we call tales of ratiocination. It's kind of a mouthful. Ratiocination just refers to kind of a logical, methodical process of problem solving, kind of working backward to solve a crime or a riddle. So a lot of Poe's detective fiction will fall under this category, but also there are other examples of ratiocination in his larger corpus. But they're all unified by this sort of central puzzle that needs to be solved. So these are mysteries, puzzles, and we eventually solve them through some kind of complex explanation or solution to what initially appears to be an inexplicable, unexplainable phenomenon. But we arrive at that solution in this kind of careful step-by-step process that's very carefully laid out in the narrative. So Murders in the Rue Morgue, a famous example of his detective short fiction, very much proceeds in this fashion. But he's not always using detective characters in stories like this. So another famous one is The Gold Bug, Some of you might have read that. That's really very much a puzzle. That's a text that's very much about cryptograms. I don't know if any of you are familiar with cryptograms, but they're a type of puzzle that usually consists of some kind of encrypted text. So that's a mystery, but it's not detectives trying to solve it. It's a little bit more lighthearted, and it gives Poe a chance to kind of create some fanciful history. It's also set in the South Carolina Lowcountry, which happens to be where I'm from. So back home, we have a special place in our hearts for the gold bug. But Poe was actually stationed in South Carolina, near Charleston, South Carolina, when he was in the Army. He spent a brief time in the Army as a young man, and he was stationed in Sullivan's Island, which is very close to the city of Charleston, and that's very close to where I'm from as well. So he brings in some kind of local color, geography, legends about pirates and stuff. But at its core, we're trying to untangle this mystery, this a tale of ratiocination, where we eventually get a solution and we solve the puzzle. So he likes those too, and there's nothing scary about the gold bug. Like it's a very sort of lighthearted, leisurely tale. The stakes are considerably lower than what we might find in some of his other texts. So again, Poe can work not only in different genres, but like I said earlier, in different registers. Like he can be funny, he can be whimsical, he can be, sort of scathing and cynical and satirical, sort of, drawing attention to certain social problems. And then of course he can also tap into the Gothic. He can be scary, spooky, mystical, but he operates in with a lot of different tones and a lot of different tonal registers. And again, I think the Poe effect sometimes makes us forget that. But another reason Poe is really important in the development of early American lit is because he helps to sort of standardize or codify the short story as it was really being developed in the early 19th century. So if you guys remember a few weeks ago during my very long tangent about the history of the novel, the development of the English language novel, and I was saying how it's kind of cool for us because American writers really kind of come in at the ground floor in many ways in this development of the English language novel, because that process really only begins in earnest in the early 18th century. And by the end of the 18th century, we have American writers like Susanna Rowson, like Hannah Webster Foster, writing early novels, sentimental novels, and that was one of the most popular genres in early English language novels. So because we're a young nation, we've been able to almost mirror the development of novels and short stories because they are relatively young literary forms. At least compared to things like lyric poetry or plays or epics. Those are literature, those are types of literature that they've been around since antiquity. But in terms of U.S. history, we sort of mirror the history of the novel and very much the history of the short story. Because if the novel is young, the short story is even younger. We typically say that, a lot of literary historians will say that the French were probably creating short fiction at least what we would recognize as like modern short fiction, probably at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, and then it kind of spread to the UK and then eventually over here. So we've already seen that Washington Irving is writing short fiction in the 18 teens, in the 1820s, and we know that Nathaniel Hawthorne was writing short fiction in the 1830s, and Poe was too. So again, Poe did not invent short stories, but he helped to popularize them in the U.S. along with Hawthorne and some other contemporaries. Well, notice that Irving's short stories are a little bit more unwieldy. they're longer, they're bigger. We were talking about Dolph Heiliger last week and all the different frame narratives, how complex that story really is. How many different narratives are kind of nested inside that one text. How many different settings and venues we have within that text. Even The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is a pretty lengthy short story. We still see short stories of that length even today, but Poe had a vision and a model for short fiction that was a little bit different than what Irving and some of these other really early practitioners of short fiction were doing. So you guys have perhaps heard of Poe's theory called the unity of effect. This is very important for us, not because we necessarily have to believe in it or think that it's the most brilliant thing ever devised, but just to kind of understand how a lot of writers and a lot of readers came to sort of understand and conceptualize short stories. Poe isn't alone in sort of making short stories popular and recognizable to a lot of readers, but he's very much involved in this process, and he's very much involved in making distinctions between short fiction and novels. Now, again, some of this novelty might be lost on us because we already understand those distinctions. But in a literary world that had only had novels for a little over a century and had only really had short stories for a few decades, some of these distinctions and definitions that Poe is providing were actually pretty helpful back then. We might need them a little bit less today, but these were all foundational in these sort of more modern understandings of literature, particularly in America. So the unity of effect is something that he wrote about in this famous essay he wrote called The Philosophy of Composition. So basically, to kind of put it simply, the unity of effect is this idea that if you are the writer, if you are writing a piece of short fiction, you need to decide what kind of effect you want your text to have on your audience. What do you want them to feel? What is the effect that you want to have on them? And once you figure that out, you need to be focused on carrying out that effect through all of the individual elements of your short story. The plot, the characters, the setting, the figurative language, the recurring tropes, whatever. Everything in that text needs to contribute to that overall effect that you're trying to achieve. So that's how you create the unity of effect. So you're striving for consistency and unity. And that's really the purpose, according to Poe, that's the purpose of any good, successful work of short fiction. And he says you really can't accomplish this in a novel. You can't really accomplish this in a longer work of literature because the reader cannot consume that longer work in a single sitting. So for Poe, length really mattered. Brevity mattered. He thought that the most impactful way to sort of create that unity of effect was to create lyric poems or short stories that could be read in a single sitting. They're not necessarily all really short. I mean, these sittings might vary in length, but the point is we should be able to read these in a single session, a single night, or a single day, as opposed to a novel, which is going to typically take us longer. So he says every time you close that novel to go to bed that night, every time you put it aside, even just for the rest of the day, you're losing some of that unity of effect. It's not going to hit the reader in the same way. So this was an interesting piece because Poe is kind of pushing back on this idea of inspiration. He is a romantic. in sort of the traditional sense of that word, as we're about to see. But Poe's complicated. So his version of Romanticism is not quite the same as some of the writers who came before him. And he's kind of pushing back on this very romantic idea of inspiration, of a writer being inspired by nature or some event, some personal experience in his or her own life, and then creating a work of fiction, a work of literature as a result of that. Poe says, yeah, maybe that works a little bit, but you really need structure. You need organization. You need a plan. And that's where the unity of effect comes in. So again, he's striving for this kind of consistency, and he wants... if you guys remember learning about descriptive writing and description at some earlier stage of your lives, you probably heard about the dominant impression that all descriptions are supposed to deliver, the overall impression of the thing being described that the writer wants to get across to the audience. That's kind of what we're dealing with here, right? Except this is writ large. This is for the entire text. What's the dominant impression? What's the effect that you want to create in your reader? And everything in the text needs to work toward that. So that's part of how Poe understood short fiction. And we know not everybody approaches short fiction in that way. Not everybody writes short stories like Poe did, but a lot of people do. The unity of effect continues to matter to some writers, to some schools of thought. It's not universal, it's not a consensus, but a lot of short fiction is still composed along some of these lines that Poe helped to define so long ago. So again, he thinks that fiction should be digestible, so he's interested in length, digestible in a single sitting, but he's also interested in method. Advocating for what he called a methodical and logical approach to writing. So as we're about to see, this was almost the antithesis of certain romantic ideals of emotion, inspiration, and sort of an irrational process. Poe is very much pushing for a more structured, organized process. Again, a lot of people give him credit for helping to kind of professionalize a lot of these ideas, right? Making this more of a profession. We talked about Brown as perhaps our first real professional author, our first real professional writer of fiction in the U.S., just in the sense that that was his primary occupation, not just fiction, but just writing. Writing different things and also maintaining different magazines and periodicals. Well, Poe's doing that same stuff 30 or 40 years later, but Poe is achieving a little bit more recognition, a little bit more success. The literary scene, in large part thanks to figures like Irving, the literary scene is a little bit more robust by the time Poe comes around. But again, he's working around the clock in all these different areas of writing, not just producing fiction, not just producing Gothic horror, but like Brown, he's also running journals, magazines, various kinds of publications, literary publications that publish other authors. Poe's also really influential as an early critic. He wrote reviews of almost every really influential text written during this era. He reviewed his contemporaries like Hawthorne, like Melville, other popular writers of the time. So, like Brown, he's not just producing fiction, he's helping to sort of create a literary marketplace, a sort of larger literary scene where he was, supporting other up-and-coming U.S. writers. He was creating, criticism, writing reviews, talking about other texts, and of course he was also publishing his own work. So, what Brown started, Poe is continuing in this later stage, a slightly more advanced stage of American literary history. So Poe's a critic, he's an important theorist as well. I mean, that's what we see with the philosophy of composition. He's thinking about writing in terms that we might consider more academic or professional. In the past, if you go back to the early modern period, the medieval period, a lot of writers were dilettantes. They dabbled. It wasn't their full-time job. A lot of well-born gentlemen wrote poetry and plays, but that wasn't their full-time job. That was a big part of literary traditions for a long time, tied up with issues of class and feudalism. But again, this is America. It's different now. It's different. Literature is changing. So now the idea of professional writers, it's not so strange anymore. It might have still been a little bit strange in Brown's time at the very end of the 18th century. Again, we've kind of talked about this a little bit with the U.S., just our own unique sort of national history, how we were getting a late start, maybe a little bit more focused on agriculture, politics, wars with Native Americans, not as much literary production here during the colonial period or that early national period as what we would have seen in European countries or other parts of the Western world. But again, now we're up into the 1830s, and that's changing. There's a lot more writers now. There's a lot more magazines and journals circulating. A lot more fiction is being written, and Poe is at the forefront of all of that. So he's important in all of those ways. But obviously, our primary focus will be his texts. So I'm going to actually stop part one here. I know we might actually prefer it when I don't break these up into different segments, but it's going to take me a long time to work through all of the texts that I want to mention today. We're not going to be exhaustive. We're not going to cover all of the texts that I posted in the week 9 module, but I just want to devote all of part 2 to the texts themselves. So we'll come back and do that in part 2.